This is Thomas Adler, and you're listening to WZRB, coming to you live from our little studio here in central Pennsylvania. It's 12:27 in the morning, and if you're still awake, well, you're not alone. Sleep's been hard to come by lately, hasn't it? For a lot of us, anyway. I've been sitting behind this microphone for nearly 15 years now, and I've talked to folks through some tough times. We weathered storms together, economic hiccups, all sorts of things. But what we're living through right now feels different. It's been 127 days since the central bank pushed interest rates up to 8.5%, trying to get a handle on inflation that hit 23% monthly back in June. 3 more regional banks went under just this past week, following that same pattern we saw with the big tech-focused bank a few months back. Only this time, it's happening faster. The thing is, you can feel it in the air when you're out and about during the day. People move differently now. They talk quieter in the grocery stores when they can find what they're looking for. Lines at the gas stations stretch around the block, and folks are filling up everything they can find. Gas cans, milk jugs, whatever holds fuel. Yesterday I watched a man pay $47 for a single gallon of diesel. $47. He didn't even flinch, just handed over the cash like it was normal. My wife Linda's been teaching our neighbors' kids in our kitchen because the school district had to close down 3 weeks ago. No funding, they said. The teachers weren't getting paid anyway. She's using old textbooks and whatever supplies people can spare, but those kids are still learning, still laughing sometimes. Kids have this way of adapting that us adults seem to have forgotten somewhere along the way. They're teaching each other games that don't need batteries or screens, sharing whatever snacks their parents can manage to pack. I haven't been paid in 6 weeks. The station owner, good man, been in this business longer than I have. He comes by every few days with whatever cash he can scrape together. Last time it was $32 and a bag of canned goods his wife put together. We shook hands like we always do, but I could see it in his eyes. He knows this can't go on much longer. None of us are sure what comes next, but we're not ready to stop broadcasting. Not yet. The phones have been ringing more than usual tonight. First call came in around 11:30 from Karen up in the northern part of the state. She's got a baby, maybe 8 months old, and she told me something that's been sticking with me since we talked. She traded her grandmother's wedding ring to get baby formula. 12 cans for 1 ring. The fellow who made the trade with her said gold was good, but formula was better. She wasn't crying when she told me this. Said her grandmother would have understood. Said she'd have done the same thing. Then David called from somewhere out near the Ohio border. He's been driving truck for 20 years, hauling freight coast to coast. Last week he pulled into a fuel stop and did the math on what it would cost to fill his tanks versus what he'd make on his next run. The fuel cost more than his paycheck. More than his paycheck. So he parked that big rig right there in the lot, called his dispatcher, and walked away. Said he'd rather find work closer to home than go broke hauling other people's goods across the country. He's got kids to feed, and driving truck just doesn't make sense anymore. Rebecca called in just before midnight. She works nights at the hospital, been a nurse there for 12 years. She told me they're only taking patients who can pay cash up front now. Insurance companies have been slow to pay when they pay at all, and the hospital can't keep the lights on with IOUs. She's seen people trading jewelry, electronics, anything valuable for medical care. Last week, a man brought in his collection of old coins to pay for his wife's appendix surgery. Rebecca said she helped him count them out, these old silver dollars and mercury dimes his father had collected. The surgery went fine, but she wondered what his father would have thought about those coins paying for something like that. The stories keep coming, and they're all different, but they're all the same too. Everybody's making trades they never thought they'd have to make. Everybody's doing math they never thought they'd have to do. A pack of cigarettes gets you 3 cans of beans now. A box of 22 shells trades for 10 pounds of rice. Insulin, if you can find it, costs about a month's worth of groceries. These aren't official prices. There aren't really official prices anymore for a lot of things. It's just what people are willing to trade. The communications have been getting spottier too. Cell towers go down and stay down because there's nobody to fix them, or no parts to fix them with. Internet comes and goes like the tide. That's why we're still here on the radio, why stations like ours matter more now than they have in years. We're becoming the telephone lines and the newspapers all rolled into one. Amateur radio operators, and God bless them, they've been picking up the slack, passing messages between towns, between families separated by all this chaos. My daughter Jessica is up at the State University, or was anyway. The campus officially closed 2 weeks ago, but she and some other students are still there. They've been growing vegetables in the quad, sharing whatever food they can find in the dormitories. She got a message to me through a radio operator up that way. Said not to worry, that they're taking care of each other. But I do worry. That's what fathers do, isn't it? Especially when the world feels like it's coming apart at the seams. The government keeps making announcements, but honestly, they sound more desperate each time. Emergency measures, temporary solutions, asking for patience while they work things out. But you can't eat patience, and you can't fill your gas tank with temporary solutions. People are losing faith in the whole system, and I can't say I blame them. When your money loses half its value in a month, when banks are closing left and right, when you can't get basic medicines, well, faith becomes a luxury you can't afford. There's talk in town about setting up some kind of trading post in the old fairgrounds. A place where folks can come together, make deals, share information. The mayor's been meeting with some of the business owners who are still operating, trying to figure out how to keep the town running when the old rules don't seem to apply anymore. It's not official yet, but word gets around. People are hungry for some kind of organization, some kind of hope that we can work through this together. I keep thinking about my grandfather. He lived through the Depression, told stories about it sometimes when I was young. How neighbors helped neighbors, how communities pulled together when the government couldn't or wouldn't help, how people learned to make do with less, to value different things. He always said the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the uncertainty. It was watching the world he'd known just disappear. But he also said people were stronger than they knew, more resourceful than they gave themselves credit for. That's what I'm holding on to tonight, talking to you out there in the dark. We're stronger than we know. We're more resourceful than we've had to be in a long time. And we're not alone in this, even when it feels like we are. Every call I take, every story I hear, reminds me that we're all trying to figure this out together. We're all making hard choices, all adapting to a world that seems to change faster than we can keep up with. The backup generator's still running strong, and we've got enough fuel to keep broadcasting through the night. I've got coffee that's probably too old and definitely too weak, but it's warm and it's caffeinated, and that's enough for now. If you're listening, if you're awake, if you're worried about tomorrow, well, you're in good company. We'll keep the lights on here at WZRB as long as we can. We'll keep talking, keep sharing, keep reminding each other that we're not in this alone. There's something coming through on the emergency alert system. Let me check this. Hold on just a minute, folks. This looks official. Emergency broadcast from the federal level. They're saying the president is going to address the nation at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. Something about banking operations, temporary measures. They're asking all financial institutions to prepare for a coordinated response to current market conditions. Folks, I don't want to speculate too much about what this means, but it sounds like something big is happening. 6 a.m. Eastern, that's just a few hours from now. I'll be here to talk through it with you when the time comes. Until then, let's keep each other company. Keep those phone lines open. Keep sharing your stories. We're all in this together, and that's the one thing that hasn't changed, no matter what else is falling apart around us. Good evening, this is Thomas Adler coming to you from my kitchen table. Yeah, you heard that right, my kitchen table. WZRB lost commercial power 3 days ago. Same time the banks shut their doors, and we haven't been able to get back into the studio. I'm running off a car battery and some equipment my neighbor Mike helped me rig up. The signal's not as strong as usual, but if you can hear me, then we're doing something right. It's been 72 hours since the president announced the banking moratorium. 72 hours since every ATM, every branch, every financial institution in the country went dark. They called it an assessment period, said it would be temporary while they figured out how to stabilize things. I've been walking around town these past few days, just trying to get a feel for how folks are handling this. The grocery store's still open, but they're only taking cash, and they're limiting how much you can buy. 2 cans of anything per person, 1 loaf of bread, basics like that. The shelves that were already getting thin are now mostly bare. People are sharing more than I've seen in my lifetime, though. Mrs. Henderson from down the street brought us a pot of soup yesterday, made from vegetables she's been growing in her backyard, and some canned meat she had stored up. The gas stations shut down completely on day 2. Not because they don't have fuel, but because their payment systems don't work without the banks, and nobody's got enough cash on hand to fill up anymore anyway. There's a fellow named Jim who runs the station on Main Street, and he told me he's sitting on thousands of gallons of gasoline that he can't sell. Meanwhile, people are walking everywhere or riding bicycles they haven't touched in years. It's quiet in a way that feels both peaceful and unsettling. National Guard rolled through yesterday morning, setting up checkpoints on the highway that runs through our county. They're not stopping people, just counting them, asking where they're headed. One of the soldiers, couldn't have been older than my daughter, told me they're trying to keep track of population movement. Apparently a lot of folks are leaving the cities, heading for smaller towns or back to family in rural areas. Makes sense when you think about it. Cities need supply chains, need systems that work. The first call I got tonight was from George, who used to manage the regional bank over in the county seat. He's been in banking for 28 years, worked his way up from teller to branch manager, knew every customer by name. He told me about the last day before the closure, how people were lined up around the block trying to get to their safety deposit boxes. Said he'd never seen anything like it. Folks pulling out gold coins, jewelry, family heirlooms, things they'd been storing for decades. One elderly woman had old silver dollars her husband had been collecting since they got married. Another man had a bag full of rare stamps he'd inherited from his father. George said the hardest part was looking these people in the eye and knowing that whatever they had in those boxes might be all they had left. Bank accounts frozen, credit cards useless, retirement funds locked up in a system that nobody could access. He stayed late that last day, helping customers empty their boxes, watching them walk away with whatever physical wealth they could carry. Said it reminded him of old movies about people fleeing with their possessions in suitcases. Susan called in around 9:30. She runs a dairy farm about 20 miles north of here, been in her family for 4 generations. She's got 150 head of cattle, producing about 3,000 gallons of milk a day, but there's nowhere to send it. The processing plant stopped taking deliveries because they can't pay the farmers, and even if they could, the trucks aren't running regular routes anymore. So Susan's been dumping milk into the ground, watching 4 generations of work literally drain away into the dirt. She tried giving it away, but there's only so much fresh milk people can use before it spoils. She's not the only one dealing with this. Food producers all over the region are in the same boat. They've got product, but no way to get paid for it, and no reliable way to get it to market, even if they could. Meanwhile, people in the cities are dealing with empty shelves and rising prices for whatever's still available. It's like the whole system just seized up overnight, like gears in a machine that forgot how to turn together. Michael managed to get a call through from the Capitol. He works for one of the news services, been trying to get information about what's really happening at the federal level. What he told me was both reassuring and terrifying at the same time. The central bank building is surrounded by military vehicles, but it's not because of riots or anything like that. It's because they're trying to coordinate with regional banks, state governments, even local communities to figure out how to restart the financial system without causing complete chaos. The problem is, nobody really knows how to do it. The whole economy had become so interconnected, so dependent on electronic transactions and complex financial instruments, that shutting it down was like stopping a heart. Getting it started again without causing more damage, well, that's proving harder than anyone expected. Michael said there are rumors about printing new currency, about debt forgiveness, about regional banking systems, but nobody's making official statements yet. The thing that struck me most these past few days is how quickly people have adapted. Without credit cards or electronic payments, we've gone back to a cash economy almost overnight. But when cash gets scarce, people start trading other things. I've seen neighbors exchanging home canned vegetables for car repairs, babysitting services for firewood, fresh eggs for help with yard work. It's like we've stepped back 50 years in some ways, but forward in others. Linda started teaching a group of kids in our living room, using textbooks people donated and lessons she remembers from her own childhood. Yesterday, they learned about fractions by dividing up a pie one of the parents had made. They practiced writing by composing letters to family members in other towns. It's not the same as regular school, but these kids are learning things they might not have otherwise. How to work together, how to make do with less, how to find joy in simple things. The communication situation keeps getting more interesting too. With cell towers unreliable and internet spotty, people are rediscovering older technologies. Amateur radio operators have become the backbone of information sharing between communities. There's a network of them that spans several states now, passing messages, sharing news, coordinating between towns that might as well be on different planets otherwise. They're using call signs and protocols that some of them learned decades ago, knowledge that seemed outdated until suddenly it became essential. Yesterday I got a message through the radio network from Jessica up at the university. She's safe, which is the main thing, but the campus has essentially become a small, self-contained community. Students and faculty who stayed behind have organized themselves into work groups, some focusing on food production in makeshift gardens, others on maintenance and security, others on education and communication. They've got a few professors still there, so classes are continuing in a very different format. Less lecture halls, more practical workshops on things like basic electronics, organic gardening, conflict resolution. What strikes me about Jessica's message is how optimistic it sounded. Not naive optimism, but the kind that comes from people working together toward common goals. She said they're learning things they never would have in regular circumstances, forming relationships that feel more real than the casual friendships of normal college life. It makes me think that maybe some good can come out of all this chaos, even if the path there is harder than anyone would have chosen. The town council held an emergency meeting yesterday at the high school since the municipal building doesn't have backup power. About 60 people showed up, which is more than usually attend regular meetings. They talked about setting up the trading post I mentioned before, but also about other things, coordinating food distribution, organizing work crews for essential services, establishing communication protocols with neighboring towns. There was talk about scrip, local currency backed by goods and services rather than federal dollars. The idea would be that people could earn credits for work they do for the community, then spend those credits with local businesses or individuals. It sounds complicated, but it's actually simpler than the system we had before in some ways. You work, you eat, you contribute, you get what you need. No complex financial instruments, no speculation, no interest rates that change based on decisions made by people hundreds of miles away. I keep thinking about how quiet everything has become. Not just the lack of traffic or the closed businesses, but the absence of that constant electronic hum that we'd all gotten used to. No notification sounds, no credit card machines beeping, no automatic systems cycling on and off. There's something both eerie and peaceful about it. You can hear birds again, really hear them. You can have conversations without competing with background noise from screens and machines. But there's tension underneath the quiet too. People are being polite, neighborly even, but everyone's doing math in their heads constantly. How long will the food last? How much cash do I really have? What happens when winter comes? There's this feeling that we're all holding our breath, waiting to see what breaks first or what gets fixed. The emergency radio crackled to life about an hour ago with reports from other parts of the state. Apparently there was some kind of incident in the capital, not violent, but concerning. Large crowds gathering around government buildings, not protesting exactly, just wanting information. People looking for answers that nobody seems to have yet. The authorities are asking everyone to stay calm, to avoid unnecessary travel, to conserve resources. Standard advice that feels less standard when you're living through it. I've got enough battery power to keep broadcasting for maybe another hour tonight. Tomorrow I'm going to try to get back into the station, see if we can get the backup systems running more reliably. This kitchen table setup works, but I miss the proper equipment, the stronger signal, the connection to the wider world that the station provides. For now, though, we're managing, we're adapting, we're finding ways to take care of each other that don't depend on systems that have stopped working. It's not the world we expected to be living in, but it's the one we've got. And honestly, some parts of it aren't as bad as you might think. Some parts might even be better once we figure out how to make it all work sustainably. If you're listening out there, if you're dealing with your own version of all this, remember that you're not alone. We're all figuring this out as we go, all learning new ways to live and work and care for each other. Keep your neighbors close, keep sharing what you can, keep believing that we can build something good from whatever's left when this is all over. This is Thomas Adler, broadcasting from the basement of St. Mary's Church on what I think is day 8, though honestly the days are starting to blur together. Father Douglas opened up the church as a kind of community center after the municipal building lost power completely. We've got the radio set up down here next to the emergency supplies, and there's usually 15 or 20 people around during the evening hours, sharing news, helping each other figure out what comes next. The air raid sirens went off yesterday morning at 11:15. Scared the hell out of everyone until we realized it wasn't a test, and it wasn't an attack either. Turns out the emergency management folks are using them to call town meetings now that normal communication methods aren't reliable. It's eerie hearing those Cold War relics wailing across the valley, but I suppose they work for getting people's attention. I walked over to the high school gym where they held the meeting, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Must have been 300 people packed in there. More than I knew still lived in our area. Families I hadn't seen since last year's county fair, neighbors from roads I didn't even know existed. Everyone looking tired and worried, but also somehow more focused than I'd seen people in years. Crisis has a way of cutting through all the small talk and getting right to what matters. The mayor tried to maintain some semblance of normal procedure, but people weren't having it. They wanted answers about food distribution, about security, about what happens when winter comes in a few months. Mrs. Patterson, who runs the food pantry at the Methodist Church, stood up and said they distributed their entire emergency stockpile in the past week. She wasn't complaining, just stating facts. Said they'd fed more people in 8 days than they usually help in 6 months. Then Bill Morrison, who owns the hardware store, got up and said something that really stuck with me. He said his store had become more important than the bank now. People were trading vegetables and homemade goods for nails, propane, basic supplies for fixing things and keeping warm. He'd started keeping a ledger like his grandfather did during the Depression, tracking who owed what to whom, building a whole informal credit system based on trust and personal relationships rather than electronic records and credit scores. The meeting went on for 3 hours, and by the end, they'd organized committees for different aspects of keeping the community running. Food coordination, security patrols, communication networks, maintenance crews for essential services. It wasn't democracy exactly, but it wasn't chaos either. More like organized problem solving by people who knew they had to work together or not make it through it all. Angela called in tonight from the big city about 2 hours east of here. She used to work for one of the major investment firms downtown, analyzing market trends and economic indicators. Now she's sleeping in a community college gymnasium with about 40 other people who either lost their apartments or decided they were safer in groups. She told me about the last day before everything shut down, how she watched from her office window as people formed lines around banks that never opened, as police cordoned off entire financial districts that had essentially become ghost towns overnight. She said the strangest thing was how quiet the city became. Not just less traffic, but no construction noise, no delivery trucks, no constant hum of commerce that had been the soundtrack of urban life. Just the sound of people walking, talking, trying to figure out what to do next. The wealthy neighborhoods hired private security companies, but the security companies started having trouble getting paid. So even that protection became unreliable. Angela's been helping coordinate supply runs to abandoned office buildings, looking for useful equipment and supplies that companies left behind when they couldn't maintain their leases. She said they found everything from industrial generators to medical supplies to cases of coffee that nobody wanted to leave behind but couldn't take with them. It's like archaeology of a civilization that collapsed last week instead of centuries ago. Mark called from what used to be a mid-sized manufacturing city about 100 miles south. He's been a police sergeant there for 12 years, seen the city go through ups and downs, but nothing like this. He said the force is down to about half strength. Some officers moved their families out of town, others are dealing with their own survival issues. A few just stopped showing up when the paycheck stopped coming. The city's divided itself into zones now, not officially, but in practice. The police maintain order in the downtown core and a few residential neighborhoods where people have organized effective community watch groups. Other areas have essentially been left to govern themselves, which has led to mixed results. Some neighborhoods have pulled together beautifully, sharing resources and protecting each other. Others have devolved into something closer to gang control, with strong groups taking from weak ones. Mark said the hardest part is knowing when to intervene and when to let communities handle things themselves. They don't have the manpower for traditional policing, and honestly, a lot of traditional crimes don't make much sense anymore anyway. What's the point of arresting someone for shoplifting when the stores are closed? What's theft when the concept of ownership is getting redefined every day? Instead, they're focusing on preventing violence and helping mediate disputes between groups. The most encouraging call came from Rachel, who's the mayor of a small farming town about 50 miles west of here. She said her community has actually been thriving, relatively speaking, since the collapse began. They were already more self-sufficient than urban areas, and they'd been dealing with economic uncertainty for years as small farms struggled to compete with large agricultural operations. When the banks closed and supply chains broke down, Rachel's town was ready. They had seed stores, equipment repair shops, food processing facilities, people who knew how to grow and preserve food. More importantly, they had experience working together during hard times. The drought 3 years ago, the flood before that, various economic pressures, all of it had taught them how to pool resources and support each other. Now they're getting visitors from cities, people looking for work, or just a place to stay that feels stable. Rachel said they're being selective about who they accept, not out of cruelty, but because they have to make sure new arrivals can contribute something useful and fit into a community that depends on cooperation. They've set up a kind of trial period system. Newcomers work for 30 days, contributing labor in exchange for food and shelter, and then the community votes on whether to offer them permanent membership. It sounds harsh when you say it like that, but Rachel made it clear that it's not about exclusion for its own sake. They're trying to build something sustainable, and that means being realistic about what they can support. She said some of the people who've joined them have brought valuable skills, medical training, engineering knowledge, teaching experience that have made the whole community stronger. The communication between communities has been getting more sophisticated too. Stephen, who runs the amateur radio network that's been connecting towns across our region, called in with an update on what they're calling the New Pony Express. It's a system of radio operators who pass messages between dozens of communities, creating a kind of information network that doesn't depend on any centralized infrastructure. They're sharing everything from weather reports to security alerts to trade opportunities. If one town has excess medical supplies and another needs them, they can coordinate exchanges. If there's a security threat in one area, they can warn neighboring communities. Stephen said they're handling more message traffic now than some of the old commercial systems used to carry. And they're doing it with equipment that's mostly decades old and operators who are volunteering their time. Emily's been running medical clinics out of whatever buildings have space and power. She's a veterinarian by training, but she's ended up treating more humans than animals lately because there just aren't enough doctors available. She told me about performing appendix removal last week with instruments she sterilized in a camping pot and anesthesia that a retired anesthesiologist walked her through, administering step-by-step over radio contact. It sounds terrifying, and it was, but the alternative was letting someone die from something completely treatable. Emily said medical care has become much more basic, but also more personal. She knows every patient's history, their family situation, what resources they have available for recovery. There's no insurance paperwork, no complex billing systems, just people helping people heal with whatever tools and knowledge they can bring to bear. The news from the state capitol has been troubling, though. Michael managed to get another call through, and he said there are credible reports of cabinet members resigning, of disagreements between federal and state authorities about how to handle the crisis. Some states are essentially acting independently now, ignoring federal guidelines and making their own decisions about everything from emergency aid to law enforcement to trade relationships with other regions. There's talk about Western states forming some kind of confederation, maybe declaring independence if the federal government can't get the financial system working again. It sounds extreme, but when you're dealing with communities that haven't received any effective federal aid and are managing to govern themselves successfully, the idea of just making it official starts to seem logical rather than radical. Jessica got another message to me through the radio network. The university community is doing well. They've become completely self-sufficient in food production and have even started accepting refugees from nearby cities. But she said something that worried me. They've had to start posting guards at the campus entrances, not because of specific threats, but because resources that seem abundant to outsiders become targets when scarcity is the norm everywhere else. She said it's changed the way they think about everything they've built. It's not enough to create a successful community. You also have to be able to protect it from people who might want to take what you've created, rather than building their own version somewhere else. It's a lesson in human nature that I wish she didn't have to learn so young, but maybe it's knowledge that will serve her well in whatever world we're building. The weather's been cooperating so far. but everyone's thinking about winter. Heating fuel is already scarce, and there's no indication that supply chains will be restored before the cold weather hits. People are winterizing their homes with whatever materials they can find, insulating with old blankets and newspapers, preparing to heat smaller spaces more efficiently. There's a lot of talk about families doubling up, sharing housing and heating costs. I've been thinking about something Father Douglas said during evening prayers last night. He said this crisis has stripped away a lot of illusions about how our society really worked, but it's also revealed strengths that people didn't know they had. Communities that seemed fragmented and individualistic have pulled together in ways that surprise everyone. People who thought they were helpless without modern conveniences have discovered skills and resilience they'd forgotten they possessed. The question now is what we build going forward. Do we try to recreate the system we had before with all its complexity and vulnerabilities? Or do we use this opportunity to create something simpler, more sustainable, more focused on actual human needs rather than abstract financial instruments? I don't think anyone knows the answer yet, but I'm starting to believe that the communities that figure it out first are going to be the ones that thrive in whatever comes next. There's been some kind of explosion in the distance. 3 sharp booms that rattled the windows about an hour ago. Nobody's sure what it was, but there are reports on the radio network about bridges being destroyed on the main interstate that runs through our region. Could be infrastructure failure, could be sabotage, could be military action. At this point, it's hard to know what to prepare for because everything that seemed impossible 2 weeks ago has become just another thing we have to deal with. Thomas Adler here, coming to you from what I guess you could call our mobile studio tonight. We're set up in the back of Jake Miller's pickup truck, parked behind the old grain elevator on the edge of town. Had to move the operation again because the church got requisitioned by the state emergency management folks yesterday. Not taken over exactly, but they needed a central location for coordinating relief efforts, and Father Douglas wasn't about to say no to that. It's day 16 now, though I've stopped thinking in terms of days since this whole thing started. Time feels different when you're living week to week, planning month to month, thinking about seasons instead of quarters or fiscal years. The leaves are just starting to turn, and everyone's acutely aware that winter's coming, whether we're ready for it or not. The big news is those bridge explosions I mentioned last time. Turns out it wasn't random destruction or foreign sabotage like some people were worried about. Near as anyone can tell, it was coordinated infrastructure removal by groups that want to control access to their territories. Not malicious necessarily, but deliberate. When you can't depend on federal authority to maintain order, you start thinking about natural boundaries and defensible positions. Jake's been helping me understand the practical side of this. He spent 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before coming back here to farm, and he said what we're seeing is communities making tactical decisions about resource protection. If you control the bridges, you control who comes and goes. If you control access roads, you control trade. It's not about conquest or aggression. It's about making sure the good things you've built don't get overwhelmed by people who haven't done the work. Patricia called in from about 60 miles northeast of here. She used to be some kind of executive for a big corporation, but now she's essentially the governor of what they're calling the Valley Collective. About 200 people, living in an area that includes 3 small towns and maybe 50 farms. She said the transition from corporate management to community leadership has been easier than she expected because the skills are surprisingly similar. You're still managing resources, coordinating between different groups, solving problems that don't have obvious solutions. What's different is the scale and the immediacy. Instead of quarterly projections and annual budgets, she's dealing with daily food distribution and weekly work assignments. Instead of shareholders and board meetings, she's accountable to everyone she governs, and they can walk up to her house anytime they want to discuss problems face to face. She said it's more stressful in some ways, but also more satisfying, because you can see the direct results of your decisions in the lives of real people. The Valley Collective has been experimenting with what Patricia calls practical democracy. They hold community meetings every Sunday after what used to be church services, though now it's more like a combination of worship, town hall, and social gathering. Everyone gets to speak, but they also vote on practical matters: work assignments, resource allocation, rules for accepting new members, responses to external threats or opportunities. She said they've had to develop new ways of making decisions quickly when emergencies arise, but also ensuring that major choices about the community's future get input from everyone who will be affected. It's messier than corporate hierarchy, but it's also more resilient, because when everyone understands the reasoning behind decisions, they're more likely to support them, even when things get difficult. Stephen's radio network has evolved into something that reminds me of the old telegraph systems from a century ago. He's coordinating between 47 different communities now across 5 states, passing messages, facilitating trades, sharing information about everything from weather patterns to security situations to successful innovations that one community has developed and others might want to adopt. Last week, Stephen helped coordinate a 3-way trade that would have been impossible under the old system. A community in the mountains had excess lumber but needed medical supplies. A farming town had surplus grain but needed building materials. A city group had stockpiled pharmaceuticals but was running short on food. Through the radio network, they arranged a complex exchange that left everyone better off, using a series of intermediate trades and IOUs that depended entirely on trust and reputation rather than financial instruments. Stephen said they're developing a kind of informal economic system based on what different communities can produce reliably and what they need that they can't make themselves. Some places specialize in food production, others in manufacturing, others in services like medical care or education or equipment repair. It's not planned from above, it's emerging organically based on what people are good at and what their neighbors need. Emily's medical network has grown into something that covers about half the state now. She's trained 15 people in basic veterinary techniques that translate to human care, and they've established clinics in communities that haven't seen a doctor in months. More importantly, they've started manufacturing some basic medications using equipment salvaged from abandoned facilities and ingredients that people have been able to gather or trade for. She told me about a diabetic man in a community about 30 miles from here who would have died without insulin, but they were able to synthesize enough using a process that a retired biochemistry professor taught them over the radio. It's not as pure or reliable as commercial insulin, but it's keeping him alive while they work on more permanent solutions. Emily said that's become the standard for a lot of their medical care. Not perfect, but adequate, and constantly improving as they learn more. The psychological impact of all this has been interesting to watch. People seem less anxious now than they did during the first week or two, even though the objective situation hasn't improved much. I think there's something reassuring about knowing what you're dealing with, even when what you're dealing with is difficult. Uncertainty is harder to handle than hardship, and we've moved from a period of not knowing what was happening to a period of adapting to what we know is happening. Daniel called from a community they've established in the hills of New England. He used to design software for some tech company, but now he's become their infrastructure specialist, managing solar panels, water systems, and communication equipment for about 120 people. He said the transition from abstract problem solving to hands-on engineering has been one of the most satisfying changes in his life. Their community is completely energy self-sufficient now, using a combination of solar, microhydro, and wind power that Daniel designed using principles he'd learned in college, but never had a chance to apply practically. They're generating enough electricity to power essential systems and even some small manufacturing equipment they've been using to make tools and components for other communities. Daniel said they've become a hub for technical innovation in their region because they have the power infrastructure to run equipment that other places can't operate. They've been manufacturing simple electronics, repairing complex machinery, even producing small amounts of medications using processes that require precise temperature and timing control. In return, they trade their technical services for food, raw materials, and labor for projects that require more hands than their community can provide. Cynthia's community took a different path, and it's not working out as well. She called from what used to be a comfortable suburban area where people tried to maintain their pre-collapse lifestyle for as long as possible. They hired private security, hoarded resources, and tried to wait out the crisis rather than adapting to it. But isolation and competition proved less sustainable than cooperation and innovation. She said the community is breaking apart now as resources run low and social tensions increase. People who were neighbors for years are arguing over property lines and resource rights. The private security got expensive and then unreliable. Most importantly, they never developed the skills or systems they needed to produce what they needed locally, so they're entirely dependent on trade with communities that have moved beyond them economically and socially. Cynthia's planning to leave and try to join one of the more successful communities, but she's worried about what she has to offer. She spent her career in financial services, skills that aren't particularly useful in an economy based on physical production and direct exchange. She's been learning to garden and preserve food, but she's competing with people who have years of experience and established relationships. Kevin's story is more encouraging. He used to work on some financial trading floor, making money by moving other people's money around in ways that didn't produce anything tangible. Now he's a blacksmith, and he said he's never felt more useful in his life. He's producing tools, nails, horseshoes, brackets, hinges, all the basic metal hardware that communities need to build and maintain the infrastructure of daily life. He learned the trade from an old man who'd been doing it as a hobby for decades, and he said the learning curve was steep but manageable because the work has immediate, obvious value. When you make a hammer, people use it to build houses. When you make nails, they hold those houses together. When you repair a broken tool, someone can get back to productive work that feeds or shelters or protects their community. Kevin said he's also become something of a traveling teacher, going from community to community to help people set up their own metalworking capabilities. He's not trying to maintain a monopoly on the skills. He's trying to spread them as widely as possible, because the more communities that can produce their own basic tools, the more resilient the whole network becomes. The political situation has stabilized in some ways and destabilized in others. Michael got another call through from the Capitol, and he said the federal government has essentially acknowledged that they can't restore the old system quickly enough to prevent permanent changes. Instead, they're negotiating with state governments and regional coalitions about new arrangements that formalize what's already happening on the ground. Some states are forming confederations, pooling resources, and coordinating policies while maintaining local autonomy. Others are fragmenting into smaller units based on geographic or economic logic rather than historical political boundaries. The mountain states have formed something they're calling the High Country Alliance. Several northeastern states are coordinating through what they call the Atlantic Cooperation Council. It's not secession exactly, because there's no central authority strong enough to secede from. It's more like reorganization, with new political structures emerging to match new economic and social realities. Michael said the international community is watching carefully, but not intervening, partly because they're dealing with their own economic disruptions caused by the collapse of the old global financial system. Jessica managed to get word to me that the university community has become something much larger than anyone expected. They're up to about 800 people now, including families and individuals from the surrounding region who've joined what they're calling the Educational Collective. They've basically recreated the idea of a university town, but organized around practical education and sustainable production rather than abstract research and credential production. She said they're offering classes in everything from permaculture and renewable energy to conflict resolution and community organization. But they're also producing food, manufacturing goods, providing services to other communities in their region. Students pay for their education through labor contributions, and faculty are compensated with housing, food, and whatever else they need, rather than traditional salaries. Jessica sounds different in her messages now, more confident, more purposeful, more connected to the world around her. She said she's learning things that feel immediately useful in ways that her previous coursework never did. She's studying agricultural science by managing actual farms. She's learning about governance by participating in community decisions that affect her daily life. She's developing leadership skills by teaching younger students and coordinating work projects. The weather's been holding, but everyone can feel autumn settling in around us. There's more urgency now about winterization projects, food preservation, fuel stockpiling. Communities that seemed successful during the easier months are going to face their real test when the cold comes. Some will make it through fine. Others might not survive until spring. But I'm more optimistic now than I was a few weeks ago. Not because the situation has improved, it hasn't, but because people have proven more adaptable and resourceful than anyone expected. We've created new ways of living and working together that might actually be better than what we had before, at least for the people who are part of communities that function well. The question now isn't whether we can survive this crisis. It's what we choose to build during the recovery, and whether we can learn from both the mistakes and the successes of these past few months. There are reports coming in over Stephen's network about strange lights in the sky over the coastal regions, but nobody's sure what they mean yet. Could be military aircraft, could be something else entirely. We'll find out soon enough. This is Thomas Adler, and this might be my last broadcast for a while. Maybe my last broadcast ever from this chair, speaking to you folks scattered across whatever's left of the country we used to know. It's day 23, the first real cold snap of the season, and I'm sitting in the community center that used to be our high school library. The radio equipment's packed up and ready to move, but I wanted to talk to you one more time before we hand this frequency over to the people who will carry the conversation forward. Those strange lights everyone's been reporting turned out to be transport aircraft, international relief operations coordinated through some kind of agreement between the major powers. Not an invasion, not peacekeeping exactly, but recognition that the old United States isn't coming back in any form that anyone would recognize. The planes have been dropping supplies in areas that requested them, medical equipment mostly, some communications gear, basic necessities for communities that are struggling to make it through the transition. More importantly, they've been bringing observers, people who are documenting what we've built here, how we've reorganized ourselves, what works and what doesn't. Turns out the rest of the world is dealing with their own versions of economic collapse, and they're interested in learning from our experiments in local governance and sustainable production. We've become a laboratory for post-industrial civilization, whether we meant to or not. The international community has essentially acknowledged what most of us figured out weeks ago, that America as a single political entity is finished, at least for now. They're negotiating with regional coalitions, treating the Mountain West Alliance and the Atlantic Cooperation Council and the Prairie Federation as separate countries. It sounds shocking when you say it like that, but it just makes official what's been true on the ground for a while now. Daniel called in one last time from his community in New England. They've been designated as a technology transfer hub by the International Relief Coordinators, which means they're getting funding and equipment to help spread their innovations to other communities. Solar panel manufacturing, water purification systems, small-scale electronics production, all the things they developed out of necessity are now being recognized as models for sustainable development. He said the most satisfying part is that they're not just receiving aid, they're contributing knowledge that's helping communities in other countries deal with similar challenges. Their micro-hydro designs are being adapted for use in mountain villages in South America. Their community governance protocols are being studied by towns in Eastern Europe that are dealing with economic disruption. What felt like survival improvisation 6 months ago is now being recognized as innovation that has value beyond our immediate circumstances. Cynthia managed to find a place with Patricia's Valley Collective after all. She called to tell me that the transition has been harder than she expected, but more rewarding too. She's been working in their food preservation operation, learning skills she never thought she'd need, but also applying organizational abilities from her old corporate job to help them scale up production and distribution systems. She said the thing that surprised her most was how quickly she stopped missing the old lifestyle once she found meaningful work in a community that actually needed what she could contribute. The financial industry job that had defined her identity for 15 years now seems like something that happened to someone else, a game she played before she understood what real work looked like. The Valley Collective has become one of the most successful communities in our region, and they're helping establish similar settlements in areas that are still struggling. Patricia's become something like an ambassador between communities, sharing governance techniques and helping negotiate resource sharing agreements. She's planning to write a handbook for community organization that can be distributed through Stevens Radio Network and the international relief channels. Emily's medical network has been officially recognized by the international health organizations, and they're providing training and supplies to help expand coverage to more remote areas. She said the transition from improvised veterinary care to legitimate community medicine has been surprisingly smooth, partly because the practical skills translated well, but mostly because the approach, personal relationships, locally available resources, focus on prevention and basic care, turns out to be more effective than the high-tech centralized system we used to have. She's been training people not just in medical techniques, but in the kind of holistic community health that includes nutrition, sanitation, conflict resolution, and environmental management. When you can't depend on specialists and complex institutions, you have to understand how all the different aspects of community well-being connect to each other. Kevin's blacksmithing network has grown into what he calls the new industrial revolution. Communities across the region that are manufacturing basic tools and hardware using techniques that combine traditional craftsmanship with appropriate scale modern technology. They're producing everything from farm implements to construction hardware to renewable energy components, and they're training people in communities that want to develop their own manufacturing capabilities. He said the most important thing they've learned is that you don't need massive factories and complex supply chains to produce most of what people actually need in their daily lives. Small-scale, distributed manufacturing using locally available materials and human-scale technology can be more resilient and more environmentally sustainable than the industrial system we used to take for granted. Stevens Radio Network has become the backbone of what people are calling the New Commonwealth, an informal confederation of communities that cooperate through voluntary agreements rather than centralized authority. They're coordinating everything from trade relationships to mutual defense to shared research and development. It's not government in any traditional sense, but it provides most of the benefits of large-scale organization without the vulnerabilities that come with centralized control. Stephen's been working with the international observers to document how the network functions, how decisions get made, how conflicts get resolved. They're particularly interested in how communities maintain cooperation without coercion, how they balance local autonomy with regional coordination, how they handle resources and responsibilities that cross community boundaries. Jessica got word to me that the Educational Collective has been invited to participate in something called the Global Learning Network. Universities and educational communities around the world that are developing new approaches to learning and knowledge sharing in a post-industrial context. She said, they're not just teaching practical skills anymore, but exploring fundamental questions about how human societies can organize themselves sustainably and equitably. She's been accepted into a program that will have her spending time with similar communities in different parts of the world, learning how other cultures are adapting to economic and environmental challenges. The old Jessica would have been excited about the travel and the prestige, The new Jessica is excited about bringing back knowledge that can help her community and others like it build better lives. Jessica sounds like a completely different person than the college student I was worried about 6 months ago. She's confident, purposeful, connected to the world in ways that feel more real and more meaningful than anything her old university experience offered. She's become a leader in ways I never expected, and I'm proud of who she's becoming in this world we've all had to learn to navigate. The weather's been getting colder, but most communities seem to be handling it better than anyone expected. Months of preparation, resource sharing, and cooperative planning have paid off. Houses that were winterized by community work crews, fuel stocks that were gathered collectively, food preservation that was organized on a neighborhood scale. It turns out that when people work together systematically, they can accomplish things that would be impossible for individuals or families trying to manage on their own. There have been some communities that didn't make it through the transition successfully. Places where cooperation broke down, where leadership failed, where people couldn't let go of old assumptions about how things should work. But even in those cases, most of the people found other places to go, other communities that could absorb them and put their skills and energy to good use. The failure of some experiments doesn't discredit the whole enterprise. It just demonstrates that not every approach works in every situation. And that's information people can use to make better decisions going forward. We're all still learning, still adapting, still figuring out how to live in the world we've created from the pieces of the world we lost. I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do next. Radio broadcasting has been my life for 15 years, but the emergency phase of this crisis is over. People don't need someone to keep them informed and connected through a collapse anymore. They need teachers, organizers, builders, people who can help them construct whatever comes after the collapse. The community here has asked me to help establish a school for the children who've been learning in kitchens and community centers. Not a replica of the old educational system, but something designed around the skills and knowledge that kids will actually need in the communities they're growing up in. Practical skills, certainly, but also critical thinking, cooperation, communication, all the human abilities that turn out to be just as important as technical knowledge. I'm going to miss this work, talking to you late at night, sharing stories and information across the distances that separate us. This is Thomas Adler, signing off from WZRB. Thank you for keeping me company through the hardest months any of us has ever lived through. Thank you for sharing your stories, your wisdom, your hope when hope seemed impossible to find. You've taught me that people are stronger, kinder, and more resourceful than I ever knew.